Welcome to Taking Up Space, the podcast with conversations exploring what it means to inhabit our bodies fully, without shame or apology, and reconnect with our innate wisdom to find healing and body liberation. I'm your host, Cassie Krajewski, a licensed clinical social worker and certified sex therapist. For over 10 years, I've worked with folks to reclaim their bodies, their inner knowing, and their lives in a world that often seeks to diminish their voices and experiences. Through personal stories, expert interviews, and candid discussions with guests, we'll unpack the societal norms and expectations that interrupt our embodiment, like trauma, oppression, illness and pain, and the social constructs of gender, race, sexuality, beauty, health, and weight. My hope is that through this podcast, we'll learn to drop into our bodies and occupy space, physically, emotionally, relationally, and intellectually, with confidence and authenticity. So join me as we challenge societal norms, explore what it means to find wholeness, and reclaim our right to take up space as an act of resistance and body liberation. While this podcast might feel therapeutic, it is not psychotherapy and doesn't constitute a therapist-client relationship. This is a good time to mention, too, that this podcast will at times use adult language, so listener discretion is advised. Oona Hanson is an educator and parent coach who is passionate about helping parents raise kids who have a healthy relationship with food and their body. She works with parents who are navigating diet culture and anti-fat bias, including those who have a child in treatment for an eating disorder. Oona holds a master's degree in educational psychology and a master's degree in English. Her work has been featured widely, including on CNN, USA Today, Good Morning America, People, and Parents Magazine. She's a mother of two and lives in Los Angeles. Hey, Oona, welcome to the show. It's so lovely to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I'm really excited to be talking to you. I have two young children. They're 2 and 3. And I'm really working intentionally to give them a different experience that I didn't receive in my upbringing, right? I want them to have a more positive or peaceful, neutral relationship with food and their body. And truthfully, I think I'm doing a pretty good job as far as at home. But just a few weeks ago, my 3-year-old son came home from his preschool, and he had this paper plate that he brought home, and it was divided in two. And on one half, it said healthy, and the other half said unhealthy. And on it, he had glued pictures of different foods on either side that was just complicit with this diet culture thinking, right? Good foods, bad foods, and whatnot. I was totally stunned that my 3-year-old was already getting this information at his preschool. And I just felt so crestfallen because here I am doing all of this intentional work at home and at school and all these other places in the world. It's here, parenting in this culture, you can only do so much. And while I'd love to bubble wrap my kids from diet culture, I know I can't. So I'm wondering, as I think about all of this, I'm wondering if we're just doomed as parents, or is this like our sentence as trying to navigate this?
Well, it certainly can feel that way, right? It can feel like such an uphill battle. We're swimming upstream in diet culture if we're trying to parent our kids differently. And one of my deepest core beliefs is that parents are influencers too, right? That we do still have a lot of influence, and that can go in a couple different directions. But for parents who are really committed to creating a safe haven at home, I think that has a lot of value. Yes, they're going to get diet culture exposure everywhere because diet culture is everywhere, as you said, even in preschool, and pretty explicit diet culture, right? Like good food, bad food. But our kids can still come home to a place where food and bodies aren't being criticized or demonized or complimented or put on a pedestal, right? So I think it really does still matter. So I want all parents and guardians listening to know that you're creating this foundation, this like soft landing at the end of the day. And that's really powerful. And when it comes to school-based diet culture, this is a really tricky thing to navigate. It's something because I used to be a teacher I love supporting families with that school home communication piece. And there isn't like a one size fits all answer, but I actually wrote a recent newsletter about kind of when diet culture shows up at school and kind of the different ways parents might explore addressing that. So it's something that I get this question a lot, and people have sent me pictures of these paper plates and even kindergarten assignments. We think of our kids getting exposed to diet culture maybe in the teen years or with social media. But as you said, it really starts very young. And your kids are so lucky that you are already being thoughtful about all of this.
Mm. Well, thanks for that. That's reassuring. I think something that's a struggle for me is they're seeing it, they're experiencing it, but I also don't want to talk about it in such a way that suddenly they're hyper vigilant around it or conscious of it too. So I'm wondering if you have any recommendations about how we as parents can start conversations with our kids around diet culture, maybe, or bodies and size and food that can really set them up to be uh, successful or peaceful in all of those realms.
I love that question because I think it is easy to become the diet culture police. I mean, definitely I went through a phase of that in my own home where my then teenagers were like rolling their eyes like, we know, mom, diet culture, you don't have to make everything about this. But it's hard, right? When you are suddenly seeing it everywhere, you kind of want to start pointing it out to your kids. And I agree that we can almost be emphasizing it more, even though we're trying to kind of give our kids tools. So I think this is one of those tricky things where so much depends on your child, their age, their developmental stage, their language skills, kind of what else is going on, their temperament. So I think this is a place to really listen to your gut as a parent. That paper plate assignment, if that becomes a frequent thing they talk about, or they start bringing it up the next time you're at the grocery store, oh, but the teacher said that's a bad food, that's a great invitation to have a conversation. But I don't think we have to go around as they're watching every show or because look, even Peppa Pig, even these things for like really young kids have a lot of weight
Yes.
stigma and messages about food. Even Sweet Elmo, Sesame Street has a thing about, I think Elmo talks about sometimes foods and anytime foods,
Mm,
which to me, it's the same. Like kids are smart. They learn like
yes.
we're telling them that certain foods go in these certain buckets, but these are concepts that are not really helpful for children that can actually be harmful. Of course, it's coming from a very well-meaning place.
Mm,
I think the key is for us to ask more questions than like launching into the lecture mode, right?
mm,
What did you think about that? Or why do you think your teacher said that? Or really starting from that place of curiosity and trying to hold back from it's not an inquisition. It's who told you that? Where did you learn this false information? Right. Because that could just take us down a rabbit hole. And my kids are like scared. I'm never going to mention anything about school again to my mom or dad. So I do think it's reading the moment and maybe even checking in with your kid. Hey, I'm bringing this up a lot, especially in older kids. You might say, are you noticing I'm bringing up this stuff a lot because I'm really worried about it? Can we talk about that? Your kid might say, yeah, I get it, mom, or I get it, dad. So I think it's really about listening and kind of responding to what you think they need. And if you feel like I can't not talk about this stuff, maybe find other places, whether it's in an online community or with a friend or a therapist, or if it's like you're really being agitated by all these inputs from diet culture, get a little find another place to talk about it, not just with your kids.
mm. I love leading with curiosity. That's a skill and a practice that is applicable regardless of developmental stage, right? And really allows the client to take, or the client, the kid to take the lead in where to go with that conversation. And you're really honoring and respecting their process, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah, and we often just it also buys us time. I think it's very
Yeah, right.
practical for parents to. I mean, this is a classic example is a question that sounds like it's about sex, right? And it may not actually be, and or it may be, and we want to have many conversations with our kids about their bodies and consent and all of that. But sometimes parents launch in, oh, here's my moment to give the talk, when really the question wasn't about that at all.
Yeah.
And so, but it does also buy us time because
Mm,
some of these questions, whether it's about sex or body size or food, it can just bring up so much for us. And like you just have that like that gut punch or that flood of emotion. And by kind of taking that deep breath and asking your child a kind of a follow-up question first, it's also buying you time to kind of calm your own yeah, nervous system,
Yes.
right? So that you're able to be more supportive in that conversation.
Yes. I mean, I think part of what makes this extra tricky is that so many parents and caregivers have hustled and suffered themselves in response to diet culture or body hierarchies or anti-fat bias. And so they find themselves in that challenging position when when kids are asking questions, right? Of wanting to heal their own relationship with food and body, not wanting to pass that on, and introducing this radically different way. And yet the culture is pointing them in this direction of these very traditional health wellness culture that's very toxic. And I think many people are, as parents, encounter this question for the first time around what are the messages that I've had around food and my body, and what cycles do I want to break now that I have my own children? I don't want to continue that process for them. I'm wondering, for you and some of the parent coaching you've done, how have you helped parents recognize and maybe address their own biases or attitudes towards food and bodies, especially when these may, be affecting their kids and can be really entrenched?
Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, there's a lot to your question. I do think it's important for parents to give themselves a lot of grace and
Mm.
compassion. I think there's this fantasy of we could just sort of like hermetically seal our kids' like media exposure somehow, and we could just sort of do everything perfectly, and we're gonna make them like eating disorder proof, and they're gonna have this awesome, but like that instinct, I mean, I feel that deep in my bones right now. That instinct is so real and so powerful. And I think taking that deep breath and knowing like that kind of perfectionistic all or nothing thinking in some ways is kind of right out of diet
The
culture,
same thing,
right?
right?
And that we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to get it so-called right every time, whatever that means. And what works for one family might not work for another, that this isn't a one size fits all kind of thing. And I think so much of parenting is we're sort of either repeating what happened in our own childhood and or rebelling against what happened in our child and trying to go 180. And this is going to set us up for a lot of challenges, a lot of tension, a lot of friction. And I think I think it's just part of the process that we're still growing and learning as people right alongside our kids. And we don't have to have it all figured out for ourselves to help make things better for our kids.
Mm.
I think just having the awareness is such a huge starting point, which not every family has. And I think this today, there's just more like the phrase diet culture that didn't exist when I first became a parent, or like I wasn't aware of it. Weight stigma is now a term you might see in a headline in a newspaper. That wasn't true 20 years ago. Like it would be in maybe a research journal, but not,
Mhm.
in a mainstream publication. So I think a lot is changing. The conversations are evolving, and parents can try to be patient with themselves. And I think sometimes I see some value in the fake it till you make it. It
Mm.
might be, you may not be feeling super positive about things for yourself, but we can notice that we're having those thoughts and maybe not verbalize them in front of our kids. And I think a lot about fake it till you make it can sound sort of cheesy. And again, none of this, blanket statement, everything I say here may not work for everyone. I'm not assuming it will, but these are just ideas that people can take that might work for them. But I've learned a lot from body image researchers who talk about the power of cognitive dissonance, right? That we can, you know, changing our thinking is actually really hard, and changing our actions sometimes can be easier. So rather than thinking I have to be really positive about my body before I get in the pool with my kids in a bathing suit, we can actually experiment with the other approach was, you know what, I'm going to put on the bathing suit, get in the water with my kids and see what happens.
Mm.
And even if I don't feel good about my body.
Mm.
And actually, what a lot of people find is that anxiety about being in the bathing suit goes down without having to do like a lot of therapy. Obviously, some people do need a lot of therapeutic support. But sometimes taking those actions that kind of rebel against the diet culture thinking, or maybe if you have a history of an eating disorder or just feeling pressure from your peer group or your family, and just trying to taking those little rebellion steps, I think can be pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I can see how that increases confidence for the next time maybe where you could lean in and try something and reframe it as, "Oh, this is an opportunity for me to learn and experiment," and go use that as information. I know so many of my friends are navigating this with their kids. There's certainly a lot of spaces in social media and culture around anti-diet culture, and like you said, we're seeing more naming of anti-fat bias and weight stigma in in these different publications, and then there's 3 times as many or more around the alternative, right? So, what they're learning about, like, nutrition and fitness and health for their kids gets really complicated. I think, of course, all parents want what's best for their kids. They want their kid to be well and healthy. And then it gets also diet culture colludes and masquerades as wellness and healthy lifestyles and things like that now. And it's real pressure. It can feel so scary to rebel and go against the grain with your own kids, especially when these systems are there upholding and delivering this diet culture, wellness culture messaging that's so toxic. This is like what good kids do or good parents do. But I'm wondering for you, exploring the research of what does the research actually say around healthy eating in kids, healthy bodies with kids, and what's the impact of different foods or maybe it's size. What really goes into that for kids? How do you measure that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm not a medical provider. I'm not a scientist. So I want to just make that really clear. But I have learned a lot from people in the dietetics field and medical field. So I don't want to, I want to stay in my lane. So I often direct people to just really accessible but well-researched writing on this topic. For instance, in Virginia Smith's book, Fat Talk, there's a chapter on the so-called childhood obesity epidemic that is, I believe, even that chapter, I think, is available for free on her Substack, where she basically uses
Oh,
that section
great.
of the audiobook. So,
Oh, I'll link it in the show
um,
notes. That's great.
I mean, obviously, I want to support independent bookstores and libraries and authors as well. But if someone is thinking, I don't have the bandwidth to read a whole book, even just listening to that one chapter, I think can be really eye-opening.
Mm.
I think the big picture is that we've been told that weight and health are so closely linked and that it's this very one-to-one relationship. When what we know from decades of research is that it's much more complicated and that a lot of, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here,
Yep.
but for folks listening, I think recognizing that for decades, we've been pushing these concepts of like fear of weight gain and pushing nutrition education that kind of like the paper plate example from your child's preschool. We've been pushing this message for decades, and it has not had the outcomes that were the goal of that kind of information. So we have a pretty decent, we have a lot of evidence that approach isn't working and hasn't made kids healthier. For people who are worried about body size, it hasn't made kids smaller. I'm not advocating that's a worthy goal in itself, but that was the goal stated by a lot of these experts who were launching different campaigns or programs or public policy or nutrition education. So we have a lot of evidence that you can kind of see with your own two eyes. It's when you once you kind of accept that or acknowledge that, you realize, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Everything has things that we've tried were well-meaning, but in a lot of cases have backfired. The other piece I think is really important for parents to know is that after opioid use disorder, the most fatal mental health condition is eating disorders are incredibly serious. They are not as rare as people think, and they affect a much wider range of people than the myths or stereotypes or stock photography might imply.
Mhm.
So I think when parents are worried about their child's health, obviously it's coming from, of course, we want our kids to be as healthy as they can be. The messages we're getting are, in my opinion, often making us afraid in ways that are actually taking our eyes off the ball from what we actually maybe should be more worried about. And I don't want parents, I don't want to add worry, like, oh no, now I've got to worry about eating disorders. But I think when you think about health, we want our kids to have a healthy relationship with food. We want them to have a healthy relationship with their body, a healthy relationship with exercise. And when we focus so much on good food, bad food, and we have to move today, or we don't earn dessert, or whatever the kind of messages are, again, that we could be getting from the pediatrician, from the school, from our community, we might actually be trading kind of one issue for another that's actually much more likely to harm our kids. Again, I don't want to be fear mongering because I really bristle at the way that a lot of parent education is kind of clickbaity or fear mongering. I just want parents to have that information.
Mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective because it's really looking at health in a more holistic way, which isn't narrowly defined by just a couple factors. I mean, there's so many things that contribute to our child's health and well-being. One of them, which includes how at peace are they with their own body, their own relationship with food, and that is something that improves self-esteem, and like the benefits are so all-encompassing. And not to mention, I mean, you've mentioned weight stigma a number of times. I mean, for those kids that don't align with some thin ideal or small ideal of a body of a child, those kids that are in larger bodies or fat kids, that weight stigma really impacts their health too, right? I mean, that is a huge deterrent to them being well. And so I really appreciate your expansiveness of the conversation around health and making room for lots of grace within that, I think, for parents as they're trying to navigate those decisions.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would that you're making me think about is when we want our kids, obviously, when they're in our care, right, we're sort of in charge of taking care of them. As they get older, we want them to start taking more and more of that responsibility for that self-care. And we know that if someone feels ashamed or stigmatized about their body, they are less likely to take good care of their body. So I think that's something for parents to keep in mind, that if my kid feels safe and unconditional love and that we have positive regard for them, they are going to feel more of that toward themselves and want to take good care of this one and only body they're going to have for their whole life.
Hmm. Yeah. Something that continues to stun me as a relatively new parent is how caring and raising my own kids can be so activating of my own traumas around this, my own insecurities. And we're already, as parents, holding so much fear and anxiety. We have information overload now, I think, especially, millennial parents with all the right things and the scripts and like all of that. And I think sometimes parents come into this real protective place of, I don't want my kid to experience weight stigma. So therefore, I'm going to hope to make them smaller so they don't have to experience that. And I get the good intention of that. And that might be also, I don't want them to suffer in the ways that I have suffered, or knowing like how thinness is such a gateway to like acceptance and belonging in so many corners of their lives, and like a survival tactic in a world that judges you for your body size. I'm wondering for you if you have any tips to help us as parents as we're trying to help our kids develop resiliency in some of this, and even for ourselves as parents, where we just see the tension of knowing that weight stigma, thin privilege is real. And how do we help our kids navigate those things?
So glad you asked that. And of course, like I'm in a straight size body. I was a smaller sized kid growing up. I didn't experience a lot of, I mean, I still got teased about my body. I think almost everybody has some story. And I didn't feel great about my body, but I wasn't experiencing systemic weight stigma. And I think it is really important to remember that not everybody feels safe to divest from diet culture. I want to shout out people like Jessica Wilson, dietitian, who talks a lot about this. And it is just not, it's not always accessible to everyone to feel like they can kind of opt out of this. So for those who are eager to opt out and feel they can opt out of this sort of diet culture mentality, there's a strategy that I found to be helpful for a lot of families. And that is to imagine if your child they came home, they were teased or bullied about some other aspect of their appearance. So let's like take height, for example, right? Because I think it's probably the closest thing where it's largely genetic, can be affected by medical conditions, can be affected by nutrition. If your child comes home and they're teased because they're shorter than all of their classmates, think about how you would respond. You probably wouldn't respond with, okay, let's get you some platform shoes. We're going to stretch you every night. Let's talk to the doctor about there are these risky leg lengthening procedures we could explore when you're older. So we might like, I don't think many
It
parents,
sounds so ridiculous when you
right,
say it like that, right?
right.
Mhm.
And okay, I'm going to help you look taller. Let's practice your posture, right? I think most parents instead would say, oh, that sounds so hard. Sometimes kids are really mean. How did that feel? Tell me more. What do you need? Do you want a hug? We would focus more on kind of listening, comforting them, validating that their feelings make sense. Also, we would probably talk about, the fact that it's not their body that is the problem. It's that this other person was being mean and that they had been taught, right? We can even have compassion maybe for the kid who was doing the teasing, right? That they think it's okay to talk about someone's body that way. In our home, we know. So there are openings, and you probably wouldn't do all of this in the moment. You'd have to read how your kid was feeling and responding. We wouldn't launch into trying to change their height. The other piece of that I'll mention is this is a very tempting place for a parent to say, well, you're going to grow taller. Look at Uncle so and so, you're probably going to be tall like him, or Aunt so and so, or look, your biological parents were tall, and so you're probably going to get tall and you'll have a growth spurt later. So it feels good in the moment to reassure a child about what their body is going to do. But if you think about it for a moment, what are we reassuring them about? When we reassure, we are unintentionally reinforcing that where they are now isn't okay. Again, I think we've all done some version of this, so I don't want anyone,
Yeah,
you
of
know,
course, right?
if when kids gain a lot of weight around puberty, a lot of parents will say, oh, you're going to thin out, you're going to get taller. So there's a lot of, we think it's helping them, but unfortunately, we're accidentally reinforcing something is wrong with how their body is now. And
Mhm.
we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what their body is going to do. And so we've accidentally sent the message that we think it's going to be okay only because down the road their body's going to do X, Y, or Z.
Uh-huh.
So I realize I've been talking a lot, but I can pause
No,
there.
that's so important. It's just like this well-intended way to support your child that like when you dig underneath the surface of what's the mentality there, it's oh, like this is still like this fat phobia and like really slowing down and like remembering what's the core of what I want to offer my child for their resilience. And that's like their lovely, beautiful, whole as they are. Nothing needs to change. I love that.
Yeah. And I think the emotional piece, right, of them knowing they can come to you with hard feelings and that you aren't going to rush in to try to fix or correct, that we can sit with that discomfort. And I think that's one of the hardest pieces because a lot of us didn't get that when we were kids.
Mm.
So we were told to like be grateful, at least go to your room. What do you have to complain about? And I think on the of course, we think our kids are the most beautiful creatures that have ever existed. I think we also want to be careful about doubling down on like appearance being important and saying,
Yeah. Mhm.
oh, but you're so handsome, you're so beautiful, right? I mean, it's okay to give our kids compliments, but I think in those
Mhm.
moments, you've got to read the moment. And if what we're saying is, to me, it's like the message a lot of kids get of, no, honey, you're not fat, you're beautiful, right?
Oh,
Which
yes, that. Mm.
like setting that up as a dichotomy and also like still saying that like appearance, it's a whole mess. And again, these are these like default kind of
Mhm.
patterns that a lot of us have learned. So if
Mhm.
you've said these kinds of things to your kids, like, it's okay, you have not doomed them to a totally fraught relationship with you or their body.
Mhm.
But you always get those chances to kind of do it over again or to repair, because these things happen and come up all the time. One other thing I would say for the kid who's gotten some teasing or bullying messages, again, maybe not in that moment, but let's say there's a kid on their soccer team who's always teasing them about their how short they are, right? To go back to that example. That's where we might, before the next practice, say, hey, I remember you mentioned this thing. How can I support you with that? And again, leading with questions, because it might be like, oh, I wish the coach would just say something because this kid also teases so and so and so. You can say, oh, do you want to talk to the coach to get, how do you want to do that? Do you want to talk together? Do you want me to do that? It might be, does your kid need a back pocket phrase, like like kind of a comeback, right? That can help them feel empowered in the moment. And we can even role play with our kids about, again, so much depends on your kid's developmental stage and where they are, but it could be just, why are you so interested in my body? Right? Or you make a lot of comments about bodies. I don't like that. Please don't do that anymore. It
Mhm.
might be just empowering our kids to walk away, right? Or change the subject. It really so much depends on the context. But I think we can give our kids some practical tools to be resilient in those moments, and also to let them know no matter what happens, you can come tell me about it or not. I'm so excited to hear how practice went.
Mm. Mm. I love that you brought in the piece around like coaches or like these other realms, because I think often we know bullying happens, weight-based bullying can happen in school with peers, but it also happens in so many other places like sports and athletics or physician's office, grandparents' house, school curriculums, of course, TV and media and these national nutrition campaigns and so on. Are there some boundaries? I mean, maybe we can take like grandparents or other loved ones who may have been raised in a time that was really different culturally with messages around food and bodies. How, maybe there's some boundaries that we need to consider when protecting our kids if grandparents or loved ones are making comments. I mean, how do you support parents navigating those dynamics?
It's really hard.
Yeah.
Because these are relationships you're going to have for a long time, right? This soccer coach, that you can pull your kid out of soccer if it's really toxic. You can find another team. This coach might switch to another. That's not like a relationship necessarily that's gonna be important in your family. But a grandparent, right, is someone like, this is a relationship that matters. Again, assuming there isn't like abuse or like there's you, this is a relationship you want to maintain. So I think of it, it's not going to be perfect. There is no magic wand. Like sometimes I wish there was like the Jedi mind trick that you could use, like to just like, we're not going to talk about bodies. I think of it as happening in kind of three different buckets. So one is, if this is something like you're dreading going to like the holiday dinner because the comments are that bad, or maybe your child's struggling with body image or an eating issue. I think there can be value in doing a little pregame, going to the person and saying, I could really use your help with something. I think starting from that place, like, what grandparent doesn't want to help support their grandchild, right? And it's not about you're doing this wrong and you're giving my kid toxic messages and you're stuck in diet culture. That might be how you feel. And maybe you need to kind of process that with a friend or your spouse or co-parent or partner first. But just to say, we're working really hard on supporting positive body image. But it can help sometimes say, have you seen the news? Like, eating disorders are just affecting so many more kids now. And this is something we really want to protect them from. So I'm going to ask for your help. Could you try not to talk about bodies around the kids? I would say 9 times out of 10, they will say yes. They wanted whatever you tell me. And it still might, and they can have all the best of intentions, but because these things are so ingrained, they're probably going to happen anyway. So then there's the in the moment options, right? So you have like your pregame, depending on how that goes. You have if your child is older and this is something they're really struggling with, you might kind of pregame with your kid, right? Where you do some, hey, you remember we're going to so and so's house. They make a lot of body comments. Like, how do you want to handle it? How can I support you? So you can do some preemptive stuff with your kid as well. I think it's especially true for kids who are in treatment or in recovery from an eating disorder. Then in the moment, when those body comments inevitably happen or food comments, this is where you kind of lean into your own style, right? And it could be changing the subject, it could be kind of redirecting, it could be, you might say, Mom, remember we talked about how we're not commenting on body. So much depends on your relationship and like your ability to stay calm in that moment.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can ignore and then process it later with your kids. So I think the kind of like we can put under the category of damage control or just
Mhm.
debrief, right? It doesn't have to be, there might not be damage, but it can feel like damage control, right?
Yeah.
This might be on the car ride home. How was that for you? When so and so said this, like I was kind of worried. And so I want to check in with you. So I think really we don't want this to become the only thing that we are thinking about. Like to your earlier point about we don't want like diet culture to be like we don't want to be one note about
Mm.
everything, but when it feels so intense and your kid seems vulnerable to these things, it's tempting to want to run interference and make everything perfect and just to accept it's not going to be perfect. Things are
Mhm.
going to get said.
Mm.
Some things are going to land and be sticky and stay with your kid, and some kids are just going to like completely not even hear what the comment was, and we just don't know. But knowing that when they do come home to your house, the more you've made your home a safe haven, right? That really matters. And kids know, like they can kind of switch modes, like, oh, at grandma's house, I have to do this before I get dessert. But at home, I know I don't have to earn dessert, right? And most kids, I think, can handle that. Again, none of this is one size fits all.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. And it's interesting you're bringing up like the pregame and in the moment and then the debrief. Something that I learned in my training as a trauma therapist is it's not so much what's happened to you, it's what's happening within you and then who supported you with what was happening within you to help make meaning and regulate and move through. And I hear that this is the opportunity we have when we're faced with bullying, whether it's with grandparents or at the pediatrician's office. It's like really creating a safe haven for people and our kids to have their experience and know that we've got their back and we're there to support them.
Yeah, I think that's such a great analogy, right? For because diet, I mean, obviously, diet culture isn't like a capital T traumatic thing, but over time, this really is. I think these can be traumatic experiences. And yeah, being there to support. Yeah, we can't protect our kids from having bad things happen to them. That's the pain of being a parent, right? Is
That's like
that,
my grief edge, right? I
yeah,
can't do that for them. I just
yeah.
have to be with it. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's where we have to like go back and watch Finding Nemo again, right?
Oh,
I
yeah.
think the instinct is there. It makes so much sense. We want to bubble wrap them. And then I always think of Dory's question to, I forget the dad's name, Merlin, right?
Yeah.
Arthur now I can't remember. Anyway, it was like, what do you mean you don't want anything to happen to him? The only way for nothing to happen to our kids would be for nothing to happen to our kids and they would not have any experiences.
Right.
So really, again, honoring that our instinct is to protect and we have to think about we're really preparing our kids to have a full, rich life and to be resilient and know how to navigate the real world. And also, a lot of wonderful things are going to happen to them out in the real world, too.
Yeah. I have one more question for you, and it's taking this bullying piece, whether it's really like explicit bullying or maybe implicit bullying, but I encounter this so commonly with the clients that I'm working with in a therapeutic setting. So whether they're a parent and trying to create something different for their kid, or maybe they're on their own path of deconstructing diet culture messaging for themselves, but their partner or their co-parent is just in a really different place with this. And so while my client might be divesting and doing amazing work and trying to help their kids, their partner is all in on their latest diet and like this intense fitness regimen. And it just really is so complex when it comes to them parenting kids. I'm wondering if you've encountered this in your work as a parent coach here, and when you have, what do you do? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's very common. I would say it's one of the most common challenges. And
Wow.
even in supporting families who have a child in treatment for an eating disorder, it can still be hard to see the way that wellness or fitness culture is can aggravate or make recovery more difficult with an eating disorder. Yeah, this could be probably an hour-long conversation. I'll
Yeah.
sort of think about
Part
my,
two.
yeah, I think, um, again, curiosity and compassion, just like we would use with our kids, we can try to use that with our spouse or co-parent or partner. That can go a long way because, of course, like, so, why are they afraid for the kid to have the Fruit Loops or the Pop Tarts or to play video games instead of go mountain biking or whatever the thing is? And trying to have this conversation not in front of the kids, but maybe in a time where you're connecting, like maybe, and maybe not face to, just like with kids, sometimes face to face is hard for hard conversations. I think it can be true for two adults as well. So
Mm.
it could be a conversation you have while you're on a walk or you're doing other things kind of side by side or you're in the car. And also maybe not springing it on someone like, I need to talk about this right now, but instead saying something's been on my mind lately. I've been learning a lot about eating disorder prevention or risk reduction. And so something I'm really passionate about, and I'd love to talk. Could we make a plan, like at our next date night or our next family meeting or whatever it is? Could we talk more about this? Because I want to hear your perspective on this too, right? Really inviting the other person in, and but maybe not putting them on the spot, right? So they have time to kind of sit with this and think about it. I think people tend to be less defensive that way, right? And they kind of know, oh, I'm like, it's kind of like when you get an agenda for a meeting ahead of time, you kind of know what to expect. So you don't feel kind of ambushed. I think one of the things that I find resonates with people still really stuck in diet culture, again, it might be under the umbrella of wellness or fitness,
Mhm.
is to come back to some kind of like touchstones that have been around a long time, like the forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest, right? That for most kids, restriction of a food is more likely to lead to binging, sneaking of that food. They go to the birthday party and instead of having fun with the other kids, they are like elbow deep in the bowl of snacks because this is their one big chance that month to
Mhm.
eat those foods that they've been wanting to have. So that I think can be a common ground because, of course, I think in our fat phobic culture, parents who are more stuck in that mindset are more afraid of binging than they are restricting.
Yep.
So you're not necessarily like unpacking someone's deep weight stigma there, but you're kind of bringing them along to see that actually, if what you're afraid of is them having too much of this food that you're demonizing, that you think, and then you might legitimately think is scary because somebody on a podcast or a TikTok who seem to have a lot of credentials and compelling arguments were saying that this food is like poison. So
Yep.
one thing is there's a lot of pseudoscience and pretty misleading stuff out there that's can be very compelling and convincing in the moment. But I think pointing out or kind of reminding them, it's something they already know that something that's forbidden is actually going to seem all the more alluring and they're more likely to binge on it. And sort of the same goes for pushing, let's say, vegetables on a kid that doesn't want to eat them. We know that foods that kids are forced to eat as kids, they tend to eat less of that over their life. So do you want them to eat broccoli tonight? Or do you want them to have some curiosity and openness to vegetables their whole life? So those are just a couple of things. And I think also if you feel like it's appropriate, you could talk about the increased rates of eating disorders and just how dangerous these are. And it's not that we can inoculate every kid. We can't prevent every eating disorder, and there's no perfect formula for eating disorder proofing your child. But this can sometimes be a common ground with a spouse or co-parent as well.
Mm. That is so wise. I love the groundedness of that approach without catastrophizing or the urgency to fix. It's like creating space to have opportunity for conversation and creating an alliance or and a united front to work through this together. This has been such a joy. I've learned so much from talking with you. Thank you so much for being here. If people are interested in finding you and better looking into the work that you're doing, how can they do that?
So there's always my website, which is just my name, oonahanson.com. When in doubt, it's an O. And then if you're If you're a Substack newsletter reader, I have a Substack and it's called Parenting Without Diet Culture, but you'll find it through my name on Substack. And there I do try to give very, what I think of as like practical, realistic guidance on a lot of the questions that you're asking. And then I do most of my social media stuff on Instagram. And so there I'm at Oona_Hanson. There's a baby with Oona Hanson as their handle. So if you go to Oona Hanson on Instagram and find a baby, that's not me. And yeah, and people can reach out to me if they have questions. I do private consultations with families at all stages of parenthood. So parents of little ones who are like, oh, what could I read or learn or try to kind of help break that cycle? Could be parents navigating adolescent years and all the body changes that come with that. Could be parents who are thinking, I think my kid might be kind of things are tipping over into maybe disordered eating or an eating disorder. What do I do next? I work with those families. And obviously, I'm not providing eating disorder treatment, but I'm supporting them with education. And then also families whose kids, it's this thing we're scared of has happened. The kid has an eating disorder, they're in treatment, and the parents are thinking, like, what do I say? How do I support this? What's my role? I also work with parents in that capacity as well.
Una, you're an incredible resource. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm excited to continue to follow your content. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and found it to be a resource for you in your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation journey. I hope you can continue the conversation with me over on social media by sharing your thoughts, offering your ideas and suggestions for future episodes, or just connecting. You can find me on Instagram at Inner Atlas Therapy. If you liked this episode and want to support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show in your preferred podcast platform. And share this episode with a friend. This ensures that more people can find the pod and will amplify our message of body liberation for all. If you haven't checked it out yet, I have a free Taking Up Space workbook available. This workbook will have you engage in self-reflection and embodied practices as you navigate your own journey of taking up space. You can find this free resource on my website, inneratlastherapy.com. I'll also link in the show notes some additional resources I've developed in my online shop to help you deepen into your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation work. Thanks again for being here, and until next time, I hope you join me in the resistance and find some ways to take up space this week. I'll see you next time.